All right. So experiments have found a way to solve both of these problems. They solve the third variable problem and the directionality problem. And that's why experiments are special. So here's how experiments have solved the problem. They're special because they use manipulation and what we call control, right? And manipulation and control, these two solve the third variable and directionality problem. Here's what we mean by manipulation. Manipulation means that in an experiment, the categorical variable, the variation is created by experimenter or researcher team, right? So it's not that we just ask women, hey, do you own a radio? It's that the experimenters actually go in there and create that variation. They might take a whole bunch of people, none of whom have radios, right? So they're all the same at first. But then the experimenters create variation by randomly assigning half of them to get a free radio, right? So in that way, the experimenters are the one who is creating. They're the ones mucking around in there, right? And that's manipulation. So the categorical variable gets manipulated. And whenever you think manipulation, I want you to think, like created, like rolling up your sleeves and getting in there, making them a certain way. And that's one thing that experiments do differently. Now, how does this address the third variable problem? Well, it addresses the third variable problem because the experimenters created some condition, right? They created the radio condition. It didn't exist before, right? So even though, and then once the experimenters introduce this, then then you could look for changes in the second variable. Now, the experimenters didn't do anything to that second variable. But if that second variable changes after the man-made change, then you know that it's caused by that man-made change. Because all other things stayed the same, right? Their level of education and their socioeconomic status, everything else remained the same. The only thing that changed was the introduction of that radio, right? So they address the third variable problem. Check, right? What about directionality? Well, the way that they solve directionality is like this. They gave them the radio. The experimenters gave the participants the radio. Is the radio caused by birth control? No, right? Because the experimenters caused it, right? We already know how variable 1 was caused. It was caused artificially by the experimenters, right? So because we've ruled out that, y causes x, or variable 2 causes variable 1, now we know there's only one direction that could possibly be the case, because we've ruled out the other one. So this one, we rule out variable 1 causes variable 2, right? We've basically ruled this arrow out because we know what caused variable 1, the experimenters. All right. So that's one of the important components of an experiment, that they have manipulation of your categorical variable. The second component is what we call control. Now, often people mistake the word control to mean, manipulation. But I need you to separate that in your mind. When you think of the word control, I want you to think isolation. Isolation. What you need to do in order to have control is isolate the variable of interest. So everything else has to be the same except for this one thing that's different. For instance, having our radio, right? So the problem with other studies is that they don't have control. The people who have, the women who have a lot of education, they might also be wealthy, right? Or live in a different neighborhood, or already be using birth control, right? So those women are different in many, many, many ways, many, many variables. What we want to do in control is isolate variable of interest. And how do we do that? We make sure we have two equivalent groups. First, only difference is manipulated variable, right? So what we want to do is start off with two groups of people that look exactly the same for all intents and purposes. So we have two groups, right? They're all the same. They're women, they're the same mix of, there's some rich women here, there's some poor women here, there's some educated women here, there's some uneducated women there, right? But also, this other group has the same mix of women, right? Once you have two equivalent groups, then one group gets something different, right? And that is the manipulated condition or the treatment condition. And so then one gets the manipulated condition. And the other that doesn't get anything special is called the control group. And it's because we want to compare these two groups. Because they only have one thing that's different, right? There's only one variable that's different, then we know that any other changes that come from that point on is caused by that one difference. Because for everything else, they're the same, right? And that's what we call control. Remember, you have to separate in your mind the word control. We don't mean this when we mean control. That's manipulation. When we mean control, think of this picture. Separating out, right? Isolating the variable of interest, making two equivalent groups, having only one thing be different, right? Okay, because when you have two equivalent groups and only one thing is different, that one stands out, right? That's how we isolate the variable. Okay, so how does this solve the third variable problem? Well, here's the thing. By having two equivalent groups, you've ruled out the other variables, right? So having the two groups, two equivalent groups, that rules out the third variable. Because on all these other variables, like how rich, how poor, ethnicity, whatever, on all these other things, these women are roughly equivalent. How do we solve directionality? Actually, control by itself doesn't actually address directionality. It has to be control plus manipulation in order to get directionality. So really, directionality is taken care of by manipulation. So I'm going to cross that out. All right. So these two things are what make experiments special. The manipulation of a categorical variable and the control, or what we call isolation of that variable, having a control group that's identical in every other way except for that one manipulated difference. All right, so there are a couple of different methods of control that one could use. One is that you could have two, the question is like, how do we create these equivalent groups? Because obviously, a lot of times you're not going to have exactly the same people, right? Like you might have, let's say Asian women in one condition and Asian women in another condition, but they're not going to be exactly the same women necessarily, right? So how do we create two roughly equivalent groups? Well, one thing we could do is hold the other variables constant. So let's say we're interested in two groups of women and we're worried about education, right? So maybe we'll have all college educated women, right? So they all have a university degree. So everybody has a university degree and one group gets radios, right? So that might be one way we do it. We just have these two groups be the same on some extraneous variable. Or perhaps you're really interested in whether they're married or not, right? So we might only have single women in our sample, right? So both groups are made up of single women. Or perhaps we're interested in age. Maybe we want them all to be a similar age, right? Holding constant means we're holding some suspected third variable constant. Now, the problem with holding constant, although it's a really good method of control, is that it's just really hard to do for every single variable. I mean, there's tons of variables, and it's really hard to hold more than one or two variables constant, right? Or else you might have to find a group of women who are educated, the same class, the same gender. I mean, not gender; they're all women. Same, age, same locale, same race. I mean, after a while, like your pool gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and then you only have like 3 people that fit that description, right? So often you can only do that for 1 or 2 extraneous variables. Another method of matching is that what you have is for every person you have here, you have sort of an equivalent person in the other group, right? So sometimes we might have age matching. So for every 23-year-old, you have a 23-year-old in the other group. For every 30-year-old, you have a 30-year-old in this group. For every 28-year-old, you have a 28-year-old in this group. For every 41-year-old, you have a 41-year-old in this group. And then one group gets radios. Right? So in this case, we're not holding some variable constant, but basically, roughly on average, these participants are roughly equal to these participants on some third variable. And so, we are, so you could do point-by-point matching, or you could do, just having roughly even matching. So for here, we might have a 38-year-old, but here we might have a 36-year-old, right? But if we take the means of these two groups, they'll be roughly equivalent on this variable of age, right? So making sure, on average, participants in both groups equivalent on some on third variable. So it might be how much money people make in a year. It might be whether they're married or single. So you might have a group of women who are half married, half single. But then here also you have a group that's half married, half single, right? And so matching is a little bit more loose than holding constant. But matching still has the same problems. You can only really match on a couple of extraneous variables that you have to plan ahead of time, right? So there might be other variables that are important, but you just didn't know how important they are. Maybe whether they live in an apartment or a house or have roommates or not. Maybe those are really important, but perhaps you didn't match for those variables. All right. But if you think about it, there is a big problem. There are so many variables that might be important. Right? Like stuff that we don't even know. Like maybe it's like having some fold in the thalamus region of your brain might be really important to birth control, right? Or maybe, some prior experience with your first boyfriend is really important. Or maybe how hungry you tend to be is really important. Who knows? There are a billion extraneous variables. There are an infinite number of them. How would we possibly match for all of them? It's impossible. We can't hold those things all constant. We can't match for all those things. So what are we going to do? Well, one thing is to trust, again, in randomness. One way of doing it is create 2 groups, and women are randomly assigned to these 2 groups. So it's like flipping a coin for each person. Like heads, you get in that group, tails, you get in that group, right? And by doing it randomly, hopefully you'll have a even mix of women who are both hungry and not hungry here, and hungry and not hungry in here. Or people who have had bad experiences with their first boyfriend here, but you also have people who have bad experiences with their first boyfriend in here, right? So they are randomly put into groups so that the two groups are roughly equivalent on all kinds of extraneous variables that you didn't even know existed. Now, with random assignment, the issue is you are putting your trust in randomness. Randomness doesn't always mean that you will get equivalent groups. In both of these methods of control, you definitely end up with equivalent groups for those variables that you controlled. But for random assignment, you could roughly have two equivalent groups for lots and lots of variables that you didn't even know about, but in exchange, you also don't have a guarantee that these two groups are equivalent. So there's no guarantee. But often random assignment is used just because there are so many variables that are just really hard to control.